Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about the latest economic data that's just been released by China because beneath the headline growth numbers, there are increasing signs that the world's second largest economy is facing some serious challenges. For years, Beijing has been trying to reduce its dependence on property development and debt-fueled investment and create an economy driven by domestic consumption. The goal was straightforward. Chinese households would spend more, consumption would become a larger share of economic activity, and China would be less reliant on construction projects, exports, and borrowing. The latest figures suggest that transition is proving much more difficult than policymakers had hoped. The biggest shock in the latest data is retail sales. Consumer spending actually fell by 0.6% during May. Now that might not sound dramatic, but this was the first monthly decline since December 2022. Economists had been expecting spending to remain broadly unchanged, so the result was significantly weaker than forecast. And this matters because consumer spending is exactly where China needs to see strength. For the last few years, policymakers have repeatedly talked about boosting domestic demand and encouraging households to open their wallets. Instead, many families appear to be doing the opposite. Rather than taking on new debt, they are saving. Rather than making major purchases, they're delaying those decisions, and rather than upgrading their vehicles or homes, they're waiting to see what happens next. And when millions of households behave like that simultaneously, the impact starts showing up throughout the whole of the economy. One of the clearest examples is in the automotive sector. Domestic vehicle sales have now been falling for 8 consecutive months. Car purchases are often a useful indicator of confidence, because they're amongst the biggest discretionary purchases that most households make. When people feel optimistic about their future, secure in their jobs and comfortable with their finances, they'll commit to a new vehicle. However, when uncertainty starts creeping in, those purchases are often the first thing to be postponed. The longer that caution persists, the greater the drag on the economic activity. But whilst the retail sales figures are disappointing, the property market remains the biggest concern. And it's important to remember just how significant this sector has become. At its peak, property and related industries were estimated to account for more than 25% of China's entire economy. Construction companies, steel producers, cement manufacturers, appliance makers, furniture businesses, local governments, banks and households all became deeply connected to the fortunes of the housing market. For decades, rising property prices helped create wealth, supported borrowing and encouraged spending. However, that model has been under pressure for several years. The latest data suggests those pressures are actually intensifying. New home prices fell by 0.2% in May, accelerating from 0.1% decline recorded in April. And compared with a year ago, prices are now down 3.5%. More worrying was the investment data. Property investment during the first 5 months of 2026 has fallen by 16.2%. To put that into perspective, it had already fallen by 13.7% during the first 4 months. In other words, the pace of decline is increasing rather than stabilizing. Sales volume continue to weaken, new construction activity remains subdued, developers are struggling with financing pressures, and many buyers remain reluctant to enter the market. The challenge facing Beijing is that property isn't simply another industry. It influences confidence across the entire economy. When house prices rise, homeowners tend to feel wealthier. When prices fall year after year, as they have been, the opposite effect takes hold. Households become more cautious. Therefore, savings increase, discretionary spending slows down, major purchases get postponed. The effects spread far beyond real estate itself. And this is one of the reasons why China continues to battle deflationary pressures. Consumers aren't spending aggressively. Businesses are competing harder for customers. Price competition intensifies. Profit margins become squeezed. Companies become more cautious about hiring and investment, and the cycle reinforces itself. Now, there are some signs that conditions in China's biggest cities may be stabilizing. New home prices in major metropolitan areas, including Shanghai, Shenzhen and Guangzhou, recorded modest gains in May. Second-hand property prices in top-tier cities have also shown some signs of improvement. But the problem is that China isn't just its largest cities. Across many smaller cities, housing inventories remain elevated, demand remains weak, and prices continue to move down. The recovery that policymakers had been hoping for still appears fragile and uneven. The investment data paints a similarly concerning picture. Fixed asset investment fell by 4.1% during the first 5 months of this year. That's a significant deterioration from the 1.6% decline recorded during the January to April period. It was also considerably worse than economists were expecting. Historically, investment has been one of China's most reliable growth engines. So when growth slowed, new projects appeared to boost it. Roads were built, railways expanded, industrial parks emerged, housing developments multiplied. Infrastructure spending often provided a quick solution. Today, that approach is becoming increasingly difficult. Debt levels are far higher than they were a decade ago. Many local governments are already under financial pressure. Returns on investment have diminished, and the property sector, which once absorbed huge amounts of capital, is no longer functioning as it did during the previous growth cycles. What's particularly interesting about the latest figures is that not every part of the economy is struggling. In fact, industrial production delivered a surprisingly strong performance. Output rose by 4.5% compared with a year earlier. That was stronger than April's figures and slightly better than economists were expecting. Even more impressive was the performance of high-tech manufacturing, which expanded by more than 15%. This highlights the increasingly divided nature of the Chinese economy. On one side sits the manufacturing sector. Factories continue to operate at high levels. Advanced industries such as electric vehicles, batteries, renewable energy equipment and AI-related technology continue to receive substantial investment, and exports remain an important source of support. On the other side sits the domestic economy. Consumer spending is weakening, property remains under pressure, investment is falling, confidence remains subdued. The contrast between these two stories is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The challenge is that manufacturing strength alone may not be enough for China. If domestic demand remains weak, China becomes increasingly dependent on exports to absorb excess production. That creates another set of problems. Growing exports can generate trade tensions. We've already seen concerns emerging across Europe and the United States regarding Chinese industrial overcapacity in things like electric vehicles and solar panels. If China's solution to weak domestic demand is simply producing more goods for overseas markets, those geopolitical tensions could intensify. And that's why policymakers find themselves in such a difficult position. Stimulate too aggressively and debt risks increase. Allow the economy to slow too much and confidence deteriorates further. Support property too heavily and old imbalances may reappear. Rely on exports and trade disputes become more likely. There are no easy solutions here. The labour market remains another important area to watch. The official unemployment rate edged down from 5.2% to 5.1% in May. On the surface, that appears encouraging. However, the headline figures don't always capture the full picture. Around 12.7 million graduates are expected to enter the workforce this year. That represents one of the largest cohorts in China's history. Creating sufficient high-quality jobs for those graduates remains a major challenge. Youth unemployment has been a sensitive issue in recent years, and many analysts continue to question whether enough job opportunities are being created in the sectors young workers want to enter. This matters because employment and confidence are closely linked. People who feel secure about their income are more likely to spend. People who are uncertain about their future tend to save. At the moment, the latest spending figures suggest caution remains the dominant mood, and that's really the central message emerging from all of this data. The problem isn't any individual statistic, it's the consistency of the trend. Retail sales have weakened, property prices continue to fall, construction activity remains subdued, investment is contracting, vehicle sales are declining, consumers remain cautious. Each data point tells a slightly different story. Taken together, however, they point in the same direction. The Chinese economy is still struggling to regain momentum. Now, to be fair, China is not facing an immediate economic collapse. The country still possesses enormous industrial capacity. The government retains significant control over the banking system, and policymakers have substantial resources available if they decide further intervention is necessary. And official growth targets may still be achieved, that 5% growth that China has set itself for 2026. But hitting a growth target of that level and restoring confidence are two very different things. Confidence is ultimately what drives sustainable consumption. Confidence encourages investment, it supports housing markets, it persuades households to spend rather than save. And confidence is far harder to manufacture than economic stimulus. Interest rates can be reduced, credit can be expanded, subsidies can be given out, new support measures can be announced, but none of these actions automatically convince households that the future looks brighter. That's the issue Beijing continues to face. Many Chinese families appear unconvinced, they remain cautious, they remain defensive, and they are reluctant to spend. And that's why today's figures deserve attention, not because retail sales fell by 0.6%, or that home prices slipped by another 0.2%, or that investment in property was down more than 16%, but because all those figures are pointing in the same direction, and they suggest that one of the world's most important economies remains under significant pressure. And until domestic confidence returns, China's recovery is likely to remain incomplete. For the global economy, that matters enormously because China is one of the world's largest consumers of commodities. It sits at the centre of countless supply chains. It influences demand for everything from luxury goods to industrial machinery. And when China slows, the effects are felt far beyond its borders. So the big question moving forward is whether these figures represent a temporary setback or the beginning of a more serious deterioration. Because after nearly 5 years of property market turmoil, households still appear cautious, investment remains weak, and consumer spending has now recorded its first monthly decline in more than 3 years. That is not the recovery story Beijing was hoping to tell. And it may be a warning that some of China's deepest economic problems remain far from resolved. So hopefully you found today's video useful, informative, and most importantly, thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Thank you so much to everybody that's supported me. If you bought me a coffee or sent me YouTube super thanks or signed up as a patron or a member, thank you so much for that support. It really does help to keep me focused and making as many videos as possible.